Everyone is already quiet. All right, well, welcome everyone to Sierra's Defense. It is my pleasure to introduce soon-to-be Master Sierra Fullmer. And this photo, if you guys were at Daphne's, I thought was quite appropriate because Sierra provided me a similar photo of Daphne, and so Daphne provided me the same photo of Sierra, so I thought it was a good way to start. As many of you guys know, that I do a thorough evaluation of prospective grad students, and so I did the same with Sierra. And one of my first questions are, we work with animals and vertebrates in this lab. Is there any evidence that she likes animals? And from a young age, apparently she likes big cats. She likes turtles, so some evidence that there's some ocean. And she has her cute little dog that clearly likes her. And one little fun, she adopted Barry from the same place that I had gotten my dog. So they were I guess, rescue puppy siblings in some way. Then I was like, okay, well, we work mainly with marine mammals. Is there any evidence? And there was no shortage of evidence of that. From a very young age, you could see that she was a little bit of a dolphin hugger, which in sometimes I will say is a red flag for me, but there is a sign here. I thought it was hilarious that Sea Otter Awareness Week was like one of her Facebook kind of things you can get on your thing. So I was like, oh, well, clearly she, was foreshadowing that, otters might be okay. It can be helpful when you're working in the field to show signs of agility. So she was a cheerleader, apparently. She can rock climb, and she runs. So, okay, she should be able to run away from any animals that are chasing her. And then I found these and thought they were hilarious, so thank you, parents, for posting things on Facebook. It could be helpful to be good with technical things. I don't know what she was doing in the first one, but we can pretend she's fixing the washer or something like that. But she can weld. It's like, okay, this could be good. Things break a lot. And then, sometimes you need to hide from your animals, or you don't want them to see you observing, so she's quite good at camouflage. She's a little bit of a chameleon. You don't know if it'll be green or red or purple, although we're back to the natural colors now. But getting on to a slightly more serious side, Sierra has been wonderful to have in the lab. She's one of the students that joined right before we shut down for COVID, so her experience has been a little bit different. It was a little bit tougher to get the research projects up and going. As you can see, if you can see here, she started her work during COVID, so even though she was outside, everyone had to wear masks at this point. So she's out there starting her work in the middle of COVID. She did help with wiener weighing, not as often as some of the other students, because again, a lot of these research opportunities kind of went away, but whenever she got the opportunity, she did. And she was a key member of our stranding response, and she helped to lead the development of our large whale response plan. So been really great as a lab member and a friend to many in the lab. See, I told you I just stole the clamshell one. But she's always willing to participate in our lab activities, hikes, rock climbing. She provides great feedback for students. She's always willing to help with coding, provide advice on proposals, and so she's just been really wonderful to have in the lab. If you guys haven't seen her recently, it's because she travels more than anyone I know. These are just a few. Disneyland did seem to be, and World seemed to be a pretty common theme, but basically this last year she's probably been gone more than she's been home based on her Facebook posts. She also held many jobs as a student here, so she did hold some jobs at Moss Landing, so she worked in the library for several years. She was a graduate assistant for one of my classes. She worked for the stranding program, as I mentioned earlier. She also has worked with Upwell, which has led to kind of her current employment, so some of her jobs have been very beneficial as a research technician and observer. She worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, assisting with the sea otter pathology projects there. And then she spent a lot of time on the water whale watching, which you can tell she's quite excited about. She's had several opportunities to present her work that she's going to present today. So she's been to 2 marine mammal conferences and then the Southern Sea Otter Research Meeting. And these are some of the pictures with the students from the lab. And with that, I will hand it over to her so she can tell us more about what she has been working on.
thinking? Okay. Well, first off, thank you everyone for being here. I'm very, very excited to be finally presenting my thesis, which evaluated the influence of human activity on rafting behavior and group dynamics of southern sea otters in Central California. So we have seen increasing coastal development and tourism along the California coastlines and coastlines worldwide. And as a result of these increases in coastal human activity, there's an increased potential for interactions between humans and wildlife, which has added complexity to wildlife management efforts. Behavioral responses of animals to increased human activity may include changes in behaviors, increased avoidance of areas with chronic or consistent activity, as well as in extreme or chronic cases, reduced reactivity to those humans or anthropogenic stimuli. And these behavioral responses typically depend on the perceived threat, which is influenced by the stimulus's type, frequency, and intensity, as well as the individual's ability to avoid that threat, which can be influenced by distance and the environment around them. Again, this can be further complicated in a social species because the responses of an individual can be influenced by the behaviors of and strategies of other organisms and individuals around them, including their own conspecifics. So short-term behavioral responses of animal groups can include evasion, division of those social groups, decreased group stability, which can lead to more frequent changes in the membership of those groups, and erratic behavior. And these reactions are often influenced by the composition of the group, such as the number of young present within that group, the availability of resources within the area, as well as the perceived threat. For example, the group size effect of vigilance states that in a larger group, there are more individuals to share the effort of surveying their surroundings, and so there is a decreased effort of each individual being vigilant within the area, and this is also known as the many eyes hypothesis, because there's many eyes to look around. So southern sea otters are often found resting and performing critical behaviors, such as parental behaviors, within sex-specific rafts, so all females or females with pups and all males of various sizes along the California coastline. In addition to being a coastal species found in large groups, female sea otters and some males also tend to have smaller home ranges, and so this can cause variation within their individual exposures to humans. Finally, sea otters, especially females with pups, are highly charismatic, and they can draw a lot of human activity and are integral to several tourism industries. For example, in our own backyard of Elkhorn Slough, we are home to several different wildlife tours and kayak operators, and it's actually one of the most popular sea otter viewing destinations within California. Similarly, Morro Bay is an active harbor that's a little further south from here, and it's also known for its sea otter viewing opportunities despite having consistently high levels of boat traffic, kayakers, and people. However, at Morro Bay, sea otters have actually exhibited a uniquely low sensitivity to that human activity in prior studies, which may suggest some desensitization. Finally, along the California coastline and within the southern sea otter range, there are regions that are protected from human activity, either due to their limited coastline access or their presence of state parks, for example, Big Sur. And so within these areas, otters may have less frequent exposure to human activity. And so when there's less frequent exposure, they may not actually be as adapted or expectant of humans and may have a higher reactivity. So the variety of California state parks like Big Sur, tourist towns, and the presence of otter rafts along all of these locations make southern sea otters an ideal population to study how human activity can impact groups and group sizes, as well as their composition and their behaviors. So my thesis focused on how rafting or group behaviors of sea otters is influenced by these human activity levels, and I evaluated them on two main timescales. I evaluated them on chronic human activity levels, which can be determined by regional variations, such as Morro Bay and Elkhorn Slough, as well as acute human activity levels, such as the number of kayaks passing through an area within 2 hours. My objectives included first, quantifying the human stimulus levels to validate the sites that I was watching the sea otters in, and then using these confirmed human stimulus levels to evaluate how both chronic as well as acute human activity can impact rafting sea otters. When looking at the impacts of chronic human activity, I hypothesized that in areas with a lot higher human activity on average, such as near harbor mouths, sea otters would demonstrate a lower frequency, or there would be fewer otters within the raft performing those low energy behaviors, such as resting or grooming themselves without getting themselves wet. And that they would also be performing fewer parental behaviors, like grooming their pups and nursing. I also hypothesized that in areas with chronic human activity that had less humans on average, there would be an increased number of pups because there is a lower likelihood of disturbance for those females with pups. And moving on to my human activity on short timescales, similar to my chronic hypotheses, I estimated that with areas with lots of human activity on a short timescale, so when there are more kayaks in an area, that sea otters would perform fewer of those low energy and parental behaviors. Alternately, I hypothesized that in those areas with human activity, those raft sizes would be larger, and so they would have more protection in numbers. And because they have those larger raft sizes, we would actually see increased number of those resting behaviors according to the many eyes hypotheses I introduced earlier. Finally, I hypothesized that in chronically high activity sites, so near harbor mouths, sea otters would be expectant of those high levels of stimuli, and so when stimuli increased in numbers on short time scales, they would actually be desensitized and show no differences in their raft stability, which is the number of otters entering or leaving the rafts. So those raft sizes would stay the same. My data was collected across 3 main locations within the southern sea otter population in California. I collected at the tourist hotspots of Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay, as well as in a control site just north of Big Sur called Garrapatta. Within these 2 tourist locations, I collected observations across 3 sites, which had varying proximities to human stimuli. So I collected them at near, intermediate, and far proximities to kayak operators and harbor mouths. These sites were selected according to their according to these distances because I assumed that they would correlate to high, intermediate, and low levels of stimuli themselves. However, I do want to point out that within Morro Bay, the far site, true to its name, was not actually upstream of the harbor mouth, as you can see in Elkhorn Slough, it is. It was located just outside of Morro Bay and along the coastline to the north, near Cayucas, because there was extensive human development that does surround the entirety of the Morro Bay harbor and estuary. So I had to go a little bit further away. So I collected field observations for 1 year and recorded geolocated data on environmental conditions, sea otter counts and behaviors within rafts of sea otters, and anthropogenic stimuli, as well as the types of stimuli present within those regions. I used the iPod app GIS collector to record those geolocated positions using scan survey methods. So those scan surveys, I recorded all of these data points every 15 minutes for 2 hours, or a total of 8 scans per survey. And each survey was repeated approximately every other week for a total of 169 scan surveys, both COVID and fog dependent. So all my data points recorded the date, the time, the scan number, and the location of the data point in order to help me with my post-processing and combining of data. And then my environmental conditions were recorded at the observer's location, and those included wind, tide, visibility, air temperature, and anything that might have influenced the sea otter's behavior environmentally. At the position of each raft of otters, which consisted of all otters located within 10 otter lengths of one another, very scientific details, I recorded the number of adults and pups within the raft, as well as the number of adults that were performing each behavior. These behaviors, as well as their disturbance level categories for those behaviors, were identified according to Heather Barrett's prior Thesis methods, as well as the methodology of Sea Otter Savvy. I also recorded the number of stimuli clustered within 10 meters of each other that were of the same type. So I recorded them both at their location as well as their type and the number of them. And I included information on other information that might have impacted their ability to disturb the sea otters, such as their noise levels, if there was a dog on the kayak, or whether they were tourists taking a lot of photos with their cameras. Concurrent to those scan survey methods, I also collected additional data using focal follow methods. And so I recorded the raft size and the stability of the largest or most consistent sea otter raft within my scan survey zone, if there was one present, during the duration of those scan surveys. So every 2 minutes, the group size and number of otters present within the raft and the number of otters that left or entered the raft since the prior count was recorded. These focal follow data were used to analyze my group stability hypotheses, and I ended up collecting a total of 149 total focal follows, as not all of my scan surveys had large rafts to follow. Finally, I mentioned I used the GIS Collector app, and it was very lucky because I was able to use the coordinate data to incorporate only stimuli within 30 meters of an otter raft for my analyses. This is because a threshold has seen around 30 meters, at which stimuli can significantly impact sea otter behavior. So this is recently published by Heather Barrett et al. And so although stimuli were present within Garrapatta, most of these stimuli were actually shore-based hikers or the occasional near-shore spear fishermen. And so no stimuli were recorded within that threshold of 30 meters. This is particularly important because that mean kelp bed that I was observing was approximately 300 to 400 meters offshore. So sea otters were pretty far from shore. And due to this, I had no proximal stimuli within any of my observations for sea otters in Garrapatta, and it was excluded from the remaining analyses of sea otter behavior in my data, which essentially means my thesis turned into a comparison study of the two tourist sites, Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay. My data was then modeled as general additive mixed models, or GAMs, so I don't have to stumble over that again, using R's NGCV package to evaluate the influence of both human activity as well as environmental variables on rafting sea otters. I included all variables of potential interest in the initial model, and then I removed various variables using the double penalty approach of Morrow and Wood, which is a standard method for the MGCV package. Additionally, the nested random effects of location, site, and survey number were included in the model to account for the potential and expected regional differences. If these nested random effects were found to be significant within the model output, I then ran additional models at increasingly smaller scales to try and piece apart the drivers of these location-based responses. So these GAM models output a series of figures for each included response, and although I included all relevant variables, in the interest of time, I will spare you from going through every figure, and I will be talking about the main variable of interest for my hypotheses. So I've got a lot of hypotheses and a lot of objectives. So to remind you of number one, I wanted to quantify human stimulus levels to confirm that I correctly located or selected my locations and sites. So when evaluating the human stimulus levels between the two locations of Morro Bay and Elkhorn Slough, both had consistently high levels of water-based stimuli, which are located on the left-hand graph, with the number of disturbance stimuli per survey indicated on the y-axis. You can also see on the right-hand graph that in Morro Bay, they had increasingly high levels of land-based stimuli, much higher than in Elkhorn Slough. And this also meant that the total number of stimuli present within a survey was also much higher in Morro Bay. Upon review of the individual sites based off of their proximities or distances, the water-based stimuli were distributed as I expected, with more stimuli present closer to those harbor entrances as well as kayak shops. However, the sites with, or the land-based stimuli within those sites were a little bit different. And so if you look on my right-hand graph, the intermediate sites for Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay had contrasting trends, with almost no land-based stimuli located in the Elkhorn Slough's intermediate site, and the highest number of land-based stimuli present in Morro Bay's intermediate site. Moving on to my second objective, which was to evaluate chronic human activity impacts on rafting sea otters. I want to first orient you to my behavioral results figures. So as I mentioned in my methods, each of my behavioral GAN models output a figure for every single variable, which I then combined into a larger figure, just like the one I've demonstrated here. So this is just one model. Any blank figures indicated that a variable had been removed from the model during post-processing, such as time of day within this model. In some of my models, such as this one, I included an offset of either group size or pup count. And within generalized regression models, offsets can be used to account for the fact that there's an expected proportional relationship between whatever the offset variable is and the variable or the response variable I'm investigating. So for example, if there are twice as many otters within a raft, you might expect twice as many pups to be present with that raft, all else being equal. For each of these final models, all included variables are incorporated within the calculated R-square or model fit. And so the higher the R-square value, the higher the model fit, and the better it explains the trend seen in the data. So this one has a high R-square of approximately 93% fit. So it seems pretty great. However, within GAMS, there's a second metric that's used to evaluate the value or the accuracy of your models called the explained deviance. And the explained deviance is based off of how much variability within the data is explained. The key difference between these two metrics is that explained deviance does not include that offset. And so if there is a high R-square or model fit and a low explained deviance, there may be something about the offset that is highly accounted for. However, these explained deviances allow you to have a significant model while reducing potential noise that could be introduced by the offset. As I have 54 final models, and every final model had different variables, again, I will not be presenting all of those. I will mainly be focusing on the variable of interest for each of my hypotheses, specifically at the location levels of Morro Bay and Elkhorn Slough. Now moving on to my figures for chronic human activity, I'm just going to orient you to the axes really quickly. So along the x-axis, I had those average human activity levels, either low, intermediate, or high, which I validated in objective 1. And along the y-axis, I had the ratio of otters performing those behaviors or within the raft for that hypothesis. Okay, looking at my results. So when looking at the effects of chronic human activity on low energy behaviors of rafting otters, the different locations had different impacts. So Elkhorn Slough, otters performed as hypotheses. So in areas that had higher numbers of consistent kayaks near harbor mouths, there were actually fewer otters resting within rafts. However, when you look at Morro Bay, there was no trend seen within the data. So across all of my sites, there was no difference in the number or percentage of otters that were resting or doing low energy behaviors within rafts. When looking at the effects of chronic human activity on my parental behavior models, again, Elkhorn Slough showed the hypothesized trend with fewer parental behaviors occurring in rafts that are located near harbor mouths or in areas with higher human activity levels. In contrast, within Morro Bay, there was a significant difference, but this was driven by that intermediate site, and so there were more parental behaviors seen within Morro Bay's site with intermediate levels of human activity. However, there was no difference seen between those low and high sites. And finally, when looking at the influence on pup counts within rafts, pup counts were actually the highest at those intermediate sites for both Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay populations. And so there was no difference between the number of pups present closest to harbor mouths, where there's high levels of human activity, or further upstream or further away from human activity levels, but there was a peak in those intermediate sites. I do want to point out that there are low R-squared and explained deviance values for these pup count models, which suggests that there might be additional information missing from these models. Finally, moving on to my third objective with many hypotheses, I wanted to evaluate the acute human activity impacts on rafting sea otters. So these figures are slightly different, so I'll reorient you. On the y-axis, we will still have the ratio or percentage of otters performing those behaviors or within those rafts. However, on the x-axis, the human activity levels have changed to the number of stimuli present within 30 meters of that otter raft. I also want to point out that within these figures, you'll see these hash marks along the bottom, and those indicate the spread of data or how much data was collected at each point. The thicker the hash mark, the more data. And you might notice that Elkhorn Slough, the maximum number of data for this model is less than 10. And so that's really important for my GAM models because they actually extrapolated any of the trends beyond that data. And so I will not be interpreting any of the results beyond the extent of my data. So you can ignore anything beyond those hash marks. However, I do want to point out that the shaded area is the standard error, or the amount of variability within the data. So if these shaded areas are wider, we're less likely to detect a difference between the data. Okay, moving on to my actual results though. So when I was looking at the behavioral reactions to acute or short-term human activity on low energy behaviors across both locations, I didn't see any reactions. So sea otters did not change their low energy behaviors despite increasing levels of human stimulus presence. For any of those eagle-eyed statisticians or anyone who just became an eagle-eyed statistician, I did want to revisit both my chronic and acute models for those low energy rafting behaviors. I kind of hinted at this earlier, but they all have high R-squared values and low explained deviances. So this suggests that the offset of group size, which was included for each of these models, is actually a highly significant variable, and that group size and conspecific interactions are very important to consider when evaluating rafting sea otter disturbance behaviors, which is why I further investigated it later. Moving back to my acute human activity, but focusing on those parental behaviors. In Elkhorn Slough, again, we did not see any changes within the parental behaviors of rafting otters with increased stimuli. Just a reminder, we're ignoring anything beyond those hash marks, and that really wide spread of shaded area suggests that there's no trend, despite that seeming decrease within the line itself. And then when looking at Morro Bay, I actually did see a trend, but it was opposite to what I hypothesized. So there was actually increasing parental behaviors with increasing number of stimuli. I do want to remind you of those chronic human activity levels, where we had the most number of stimuli in those intermediate sites and the most number of parental behaviors and pups in those intermediate sites. So this trend was actually driven by that intermediate site, which is actually no nursery zone. So there were more pups there, and therefore there were more parental behaviors. Moving on to the effects of acute human activity on group size. Within Elkhorn Slough, again, I saw no trend. So the group sizes did not change with increasing stimulus presence. But in Morro Bay, I did see an increase in group size with increasing stimuli up to a threshold. So around 15, when there's around 15 stimuli within 30 meters, you would see the largest raft sizes, but then it would stop increasing beyond this point. So this suggests that there might be some sort of interaction between raft size and stimulus presence. I want to move on to my models evaluating the effects of raft size on resting sea otters. But I want to point out that these x-axes are different because I'm looking at raft sizes, not human activity levels. So I will have the number of otters within a raft on the x-axis. I also want to point out that this means that the distribution of my data is different. So I have a lot wider spread and a lot more data for each of those, which likely influenced the ability to have much tighter shaded areas. So within both of my locations, I actually saw increased numbers of otters resting within those larger rafts, which supports the many eyes hypotheses. Finally, I'm going to move on to my last model, which evaluated raft stabilities using that focal follow data. And I was only looking at the chronically high activity sites located near those harbor mouths. So in Elkhorn Slough, for both of these models, we're going to go back to those stimulus counts on the x-axis. And in Elkhorn Slough, we don't have very much data, but there wasn't a trend. And so sea otters did not have an increasing number of otters leaving or entering rafts, as there were more stimuli present just outside of the harbor within the slough. But if you look at Morro Bay, there is actually a threshold at which the stability of raft sizes was impacted. So when there were approximately 15 stimuli located within 30 meters of those otter rafts, we started to see increasing numbers of otters both leaving and entering those rafts, which suggests that, these thresholds might indicate some resensitization of individuals. This threshold of 15 stimuli also matches those thresholds seen within my group size models. However, those group size models with the highest number of otters when there are 15 stimuli nearby were evaluated using my scan survey data. And again, these raft stabilities were evaluated using my focal follow data. So it's kind of a double validation. So to review my many results, when quantifying human stimulus levels, high human activity levels can look differently based off of the locations and their unique landscapes. For example, in Morro Bay, where there's a much higher level of land-based activity, particularly because it's a larger harbor and there's a lot more human infrastructure, we were able to see a majority of land-based stimuli present. In contrast, in Elkhorn Slough, there's not very much shoreline accessibility once you go upstream within the slough, so most of the stimuli were water-based kayaks. And these regional differences in accessibility and proximity to human infrastructure then influence the type, frequency, and intensity of the stimuli that were encountered by those otters. And this variation in the stimuli themselves then affected their behavioral responses between these two locations. Furthermore, within Garrapatta, there were no stimuli recorded within the suggested radius of influence, so within those 30 meters. However, I did actually see behavioral reactions to more distant stimuli during my observations. They're just not in my models. I actually saw the highest frequency of full flushes, which is when the entire group of otters alerts to a stimulus and then dives below the water, and is the most severe behavioral response. And again, I talked about those exposure to coastlines. So in those regions where they might have fewer exposures to human stimuli, they may actually be more reactive, or in some publications, more wild otters. And so it's really important that when you're planning either future studies of sea otter disturbance or even regional management plans for these populations, that you evaluate sea otter populations near human infrastructure and tourism differently from how you evaluate populations that are further away from human infrastructure. Before diving deeper into the effects I saw with my chronic human activity, I'm going to refresh your memory on my hypotheses and my findings. So Elkhorn Slough sea otters pretty much behaved as I expected. They had fewer low energy behaviors in rafts and fewer parental behaviors when there were really high average amounts of human activity, so near those harbor mouths and near kayak shops. However, Morro Bay sea otters did not show any behavioral shifts suggesting desensitization to these chronic human activity levels. Additionally, there was no difference seen between the number of pup counts present despite changes in long-term human activity level, despite the peak seen in those intermediate sites, which again is a known nursery zone. So what does this mean in the big picture? Essentially, location matters. So just like the human activity itself, which varied between these two locations, the impacts of that human activity on those rafting sea otters are location specific. So sea otters in Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay reacted differently due to the unique characteristics of their own landscapes. In Elkhorn Slough, where their main human activity was water-based kayaks, otters typically demonstrated selective use of their habitats and avoidance of areas with chronic human activity levels. And this was likely influenced by the availability of nearby sites protected from human activity with low transiting costs, because remember that low activity site was just upstream of the slough. This is especially important for sensitive or energetically limited individuals like nursing females. However, in Morro Bay, the limited behavioral reactivity suggests that there may be a baseline desensitization to chronic human activity within the Morro Bay subpopulation. Most of the stimuli were land-based within Morro Bay, and this likely influenced their increased desensitization. So, the optimal escape theory states that animals will moderate their flight responses according to the perceived risk of a predator, or in humans' case, a non-lethal predator. Therefore, sea otters can respond differently to land and water-based stimuli, as they may perceive the risk of these stimuli differently. Sea otters are marine mammals and spend the majority of their time in the water, and they're pretty awkward when they are out of the water, as well as their disturbance response to be to return to the water. And so if there's a land-based stimuli, it's less likely to interfere with this escape response, whereas a water-based stimuli might be in their direction of escape. So those land-based stimuli may again be perceived as a lower threat. Furthermore, because of Morro Bay's extensive human development, such as the towns of Morro Bay and Los Osos, which is upstream within the Morro Bay Slough, as well as active oyster farms within the slough, in order to find those lower human activity areas, sea otters actually must leave the harbor and travel all the way along the coastline to much further regions. So in addition to increasing these transiting risks, sea otters are also having to go into more exposed coastline, particularly in an area that has recorded high shark bite fatalities. And so these energetic trade-offs between predation and transiting costs versus the protection in rafts while avoiding human disturbance may contribute to that desensitization, particularly because, again, land-based stimuli might not be quite as threatening as a great white shark. However, I do want to note that I was only evaluating behavioral impacts. And so in order to fully understand the impacts of disturbance on a sea otter, there may be non-visible effects that require physiological data to interpret the large-scale desensitization or habituation of an individual. So individuals with few alternative habitats can remain in an area with disturbance despite increased physiological consequences, while those with more habitat options might choose to just leave and go somewhere else. Finally, within my chronic human activity areas, there are some low human activity areas where rafting had variable effectiveness. So for example, in Morro Bay, where there's open coastlines, although there may not be humans, rafting can provide protection from predators. But in more sheltered locations where there's both low numbers of humans and lower predation, and particularly if there's areas where the shoreline's accessible and sea otters can haul out, it may be more beneficial for an individual to haul out on its own to both thermoregulate as well as rest, rather than remaining in larger rafts and facing potential disturbance by their own conspecifics within the raft. I don't know if any of you have ever been woken up at a slumber party because somebody woke up, but it's kind of the same thing. So future studies within these protected sites should also include those solitary otters or non-rafting otters, particularly those with putts, to assess how often these individual females might utilize this behavior and how significant it might be for their behavior, particularly within those low human stimulus areas. All right, moving on to my Objective 3 hypotheses and results. Just another refresher, Elkhorn Slough sea otters did not behave as hypothesized. They did not seem to react to any short-term changes in those stimulus levels. And Morro Bay otters also did not seem to react as far as their low energy behaviors, so they did not change how often they were resting or low grooming, when there were increased number of stimuli. However, there were increased parental behaviors in regions with the most stimuli within Morro Bay. And again, this was driven by that intermediate site, which is a known nursery zone, so you would expect parental behaviors. When looking at the group size, in Elkhorn Slough, again, there was no change. So they didn't seem to react to human activity levels increasing on a short term by rafting in larger groups. In Morro Bay, they did behave as hypothesized, so more otters did raft in larger groups with increased stimuli, but only up to that threshold of about 15 stimuli within 30 meters. Finally, sea otters at both locations rested more in larger groups, so the many eyes hypothesis was supported, which kind of validates my data a little bit. And when looking at those chronically high activity sites near those harbor mouths, sea otters did not show any level of change in their stabilities in Elkhorn Slough. So again, those raft sizes didn't change. More otters did not leave or enter rafts with increasing stimulus levels in Elkhorn Slough. But in Morro Bay, we did see that destabilization of rafts around 15 meters. So otters started to leave and enter rafts for various behavioral responses when there were 15 stimuli present. So one of my key takeaways is that female sea otters primarily respond to those chronic human activity levels, which is selective habitat use and avoidance or desensitization in extreme cases, as we reviewed in Objective 2, rather than using energy-intensive short-term acute responses, which I evaluate in Objective 3. They demonstrated site-specific or localized tolerance of changes in those stimuli, which was based off of that expected level of stimuli. For example, in variable habitats that had nearby sheltered areas, such as Elkhorn Slough, one might expect sea otters to distribute themselves according to their individual tolerances to human and anthropogenic stimuli. So a sea otter that's located near high levels of human stimuli, like kayak shops and harbor mouths, likely demonstrate greater tolerance of human activity because they expect those kayaks to be there. But if you move further back into those transition zones or intermediate sites where they might be between prime foraging areas and prime resting areas, they may show slightly increased sensitivities. So when there's really high levels of stimuli or more extreme stimuli, they might choose to leave the area and go elsewhere since they're right next to it. In those areas where they're far enough away from human stimuli or they're protected and human stimuli are not typically there, we might actually see the highest level of reactivity because they're not used to seeing them. And we did actually see this in my observations when kayakers ignored the no entry rules or observers had to go collect their data within the slough. You would see higher reactivities to individuals. Even in locations where sea otters exhibited increased tolerance to chronic or long-term human activity, such as in Morro Bay, despite having localized desensitization to some levels of human stimuli, you did start to see increased sensitivity of the most sensitive individuals when stimulus levels exceeded the avoidance threshold. They did, again, restabilize those raft size beyond this threshold, and so we stopped seeing otters leaving and entering those rafts. And so this suggests that those sensitive otters are likely the ones leaving at that threshold, and the more tolerant otters have remained beyond that threshold. However, it's important to point out that the most sensitive otters were likely females with pups. So I often saw females with pups the first ones to leave those rafts when those stimulus levels started to increase. And this actually is supported by the asset protection principle, which states that those assets with the largest reproductive value are the ones that are the most important to protect. So sea otters that are at different stages of their pregnancy or different pup rearing stages might evaluate that risk differently and therefore react differently. So it would be really important for future disturbance studies to include both sex and reproductive status to allow us to evaluate how these more minute details can impact their behavioral reactions. Furthermore, studies in other species have suggested that individuals may react differently, particularly to repeated exposures, so chronic stimulus, according to differences in their personalities or their temperaments. However, in order to do that, you need to be able to tell the individuals apart, and you can't do that with sea otters just by looking at them. So this would require individual identification through tracking of tagged individuals. Finally, it's really important to note that even the most tolerant otter can become resensitized if the perceived threat level, whichever that threat level is, exceeds whatever their threshold is. So my key takeaways is that otters primarily respond to those chronic human activity levels. However, they demonstrate regional desensitization to short-term human activity. So they typically don't respond. Their responses are highly influenced by the type of stimulus present within their environment, particularly whether they're land-based or water-based, because they can be perceived as different threat levels. And it's especially influenced by the availability of nearby refuges for those sea otters. For example, if there is a nearby refuge, sea otters will likely demonstrate selective habitat use or avoidance in areas with chronic or extreme levels of stimuli. But if they don't have a nearby refuge and nowhere to escape to, if the stimuli is deemed non-threatening or low-threatening, they'll probably just ignore it, so they'll be desensitized. However, if that non-threatening stimuli becomes 20 slightly threatening stimuli, or one really scary stimuli comes in, they may then demonstrate a short-term and stronger avoidance response. So these findings highlight the complexity of sea otter and human interactions and emphasize the need for region-specific management strategies when evaluating how to both study and protect those sea otter populations. These region-specific strategies should account for the accessibility of humans to those populations, as well as the human activity levels, and the otter's individual variability in their reactivity according to their individual traits, such as pup rearing, pregnancy stage, etc. Identifying these similarities between subpopulations can also help improve ongoing conservation and ecotourism practices, as you might be able to compare the known behavioral traits of one location with an unknown location's population or potential population. Notably, this study actually recorded very few stimuli within that established 30-meter threshold within Elkhorn Slough, even right next to the harbor mouth, so in that area with chronically high levels of human activity, which suggests that ongoing efforts by Sea Otter Savvy to both inform and enforce those distancing guidelines to reduce disturbance have actually been successful. Additionally, it highlights that maintaining or establishing protections for those sheltered habitat areas within those high areas of human activity is essential. So they provide alternatives which allow sea otters to avoid a region rather than potentially increasing non-visible physiological stress effects. So to improve our understanding of these dynamics, increased evaluations of group size effects needs to continue to occur. Group size should be evaluated within other behavioral studies, and individual identification and tracking efforts of sea otters are needed. And with that, I would like to thank my committee members, Geeta, Amanda, and Nicole, for all of your valuable feedback and support. Geeta, thank you for taking me into your lab and supporting me throughout not only my thesis work, but the many field and job opportunities that might have slightly delayed how long my thesis took. Thank you to Jenna, Heather, and Caitlin for all your guidance on my methods and my sample analyses. And Karen, thank you for being my statistics and emotional support. Dang it. Your hours of coffee shop coding and all of your late night editing sessions have really shaped me as a scientist. To my Otter Observer team, who stood out in the wind, fog, and I definitely owe you all hot chocolate and meals. Thank you so much for helping me collect my data. Specifically, a special shout out to Cheryl. And thank you for allowing a desperate graduate student to sleep in your driveway just to collect data throughout COVID, and also providing the best morning lattes when I woke up in my Prius. Ron, in addition to keeping my COVID trail cameras alive as backup data, your cheerful smile and can-do attitude was the brightest boost to my days in the field. Thank you to my funding sources who helped support this research, including MLML Wave Award and CSU Coast. And a huge thank you to everyone who made my time at Moss Landing wonderful. Special shout out to Daphne. I couldn't have asked for a better lab partner in crime. Mari, Keys, Gammon, Z, Rachel, Sean, Kinsey, Dylan, Carly, the entire vertebrate ecology lab who is here, and those of you from the 2019 COVID cohort. I can't possibly list everybody, but please know how much your friendship and support has meant. Also, thank you to all of those who watched Blackberries as I went on all of my adventures. She misses you dearly. To my field team and MWVCRC families, not only could I not have finished this thesis without you, I would not have wanted to. Thank you for the midnight snacks, the gallons of cheese balls, blackberry scavenging, doers, otter adventures, down days excursions, and dealing with more than a few tears, most of them happy. And Karen and Scott, words cannot express how grateful I am for your support, mentorship, and friendship. You've inspired and improved me. Thank you for adopting me into your world and your home. You're the best science parents ever. And finally, to my family, thank you for supporting me out throughout every deadline, change of plans, missed family event, and there were many, and working holidays. I know that I answered my phone too often on Christmas, but you guys were super patient. You've all inspired me to work towards my dreams, and I share each and every one of my accomplishments with all of you. David, I'm so glad that my thesis took the perfect amount of time so that you could be the best part of my graduate school experience. Thank you for being my favorite adventure. And with that, I will take questions. I only half cried.
Thanks for the great talk.
Yeah.
I had a question about the full raft submerge behavior.
Yeah.
And you noticed that it happened more in Garrapatta despite there being no disturbances within 30 meters.
Yeah.
Would you be able to speak to like what kinds of disturbances at the more disturbed sites led to those behaviors, even though it happened less?
Yes. So I also saw it, for example, within Alcorn Slough's low activity site. There are signs that say no kayak entry throughout Yampa. It's a protected area, but sometimes it's very hard to learn to kayak and read signs at the same time. So there would be kayakers going up the slough, and oftentimes it's really when they don't expect them to be there. So the slough has lots of windy channels, so if a kayak popped around the corner of a channel and there was a raft of otters that was not expecting a kayak to be there, we would often see these really dramatic full flush behaviors. They would actually swim all the way out of the channel and back into the main slough. So that's a pretty common one in Alcorn Slough. You could still see it in the higher activity sites. Oftentimes it was tourists with cell phones wanting to take a really close selfie and not realizing just how fast those currents are. They drifted really close. So it's typically when that 30-meter threshold became a 1 to 2 meter threshold, you would see that. But it was also dependent on those individual otters and where they were located.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Great talk, Sierra. Thank you. Were you able to tease apart the land-based versus water-based within a site, like within Elkhorn Slough? Was water-based actually, were they more reactive to water-based than land-based?
I incorporated it within my models, but I did not parse it out to a certain level of detail. I just had too many models to start with.
Oh, I know.
Understatement of the hour. However, I did have some of those behavioral data, so I did record those notes. And so one of the most, effective on a disturbance standpoint stimuli for land-based would be if a fisherman was on shore with a dog, or if a fisherman was on shore casting their reel directly into the otters. That being said, within Morro Bay, the intermediate site's called South T Pier, and it's essentially a pier that fully surrounds where these otters rest and raft, and fishermen will cast theirs right off the pier, and they still won't react. So it kind of depends on how often it occurs, and if those otters are expecting that behavior to happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Great talk, Sierra. I think I finally fully understand it after like hearing it for like the 4th time. It's just so many results, and I think you highlighted it very well at the end. Like, it's just a very complex issue with a lot of things going on. Kind of to that note, I guess, if you, like, what would you do differently, or what would you look at differently, or maybe site selection differently if you were to kind of do this again, or if someone else wanted to follow up on the study elsewhere potentially?
Yeah, I do think it would be really interesting. So I did talk about that one key difference between Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay was the location of that low human activity site. Although they do have a town at the back of the Morro Bay Slough, I think it would be really interesting to try and find like the lowest human activity site within the Morro Bay Harbor itself to be able to evaluate if that shift happens. Additionally, I think that just more data is always helpful. Not that I want to tell someone to do more than a year, but it's always really helpful to do more data. And specifically, it is actually an ongoing effort. Now, the sea otters and the Elkhorn Slough were not tagged when I collected my data, but there are increasing numbers of individually identified otters within the slough. So you're able to use those individual otters to do more of my focal follow methods, where you would track an individual and see how that individual reacted to a specific stimuli or a specific number of stimuli. And so if you had a large data set of those individual reactions, you might be able to see if they are distributed according to their tolerance, because some individuals might spend more time in one area or another. And you would also be able to identify if there's a different threshold for different otters. Yeah. No shortage of questions.
Great work, Sierra. That was amazing. I'm just curious if the sea otters have like certain periods in which they breed more and then other periods that they don't as much. And do you see any differences in terms of this kind of like, stimuli from human activities and the impact on those populations across these periods?
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to where I showed you just one of my models. So you'll see month right in the middle. So that was my indicator of seasonality. So it's actually a cyclical figure. So on either end is December, and in the middle is the summer. And almost all of my models had the same trend, with the highest number of low energy behaviors, the highest number of parental behaviors, the largest rafts forming in those winter months, and the lowest of all of those in the summer months. And this can correlate although sea otters do pup year round, there is an increased seasonality in the spring similar to other species. But this also correlates to the highest number of kayaks, the highest number of tourism in the summer, creating the lowest number of resting and parental behaviors in those really large rafts. Additionally, in the winter, you have not only fewer tourists, but you have more winter storms. And so the protection in rafting can both be protection, but also just necessity, because there's fewer of those kelp patches for them to wrap themselves in and protect themselves from those extreme weathers. So the seasonality, again, a really complex question, but we did get a little bit of that information in my models. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, Sierra, great job. Yeah, this was really exciting to see come together. And I wanted to follow on Vicky's question a bit. I was thinking about you mentioned that the intermediate site at Morro Bay is a pup nursing zone. How common are these zones, and are those potential focal areas to kind of ask questions specifically about how group dynamics might, I guess, scale with human activity later? And how many nursing zones are there within females' ranges to choose from?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know all of the answers to it. But one thing that I thought was really intriguing between my two locations is both of them had a nursery zone. So Morro Bay's nursery zone was that intermediate site, and again, sea otters showed desensitization on that chronic scale across all of them. And I personally think that high level of human stimulus is because small little sea otter pups are very charismatic. And so people want to go look at those pups and get those photos, but it contributes to that desensitization cycle. However, in Elkhorn Slough, there was a past thesis that actually was looking at the Elkhorn Slough dynamics and realized that there was a nursery zone at Yampa, which was my low activity site. And so within Yampa, or within Elkhorn Slough, that is the region with low human activity, lots of channels, lots of pickleweed for them to haul out and thermoregulate. Female sea otters spend an insane amount of energy just to raise their pups, occasionally to a lethal extent. And so in Elkhorn Slough, we actually saw that nursery zone distributed similar to their avoidance behaviors, where they had that spread of sea otters' tolerance, and most of the least tolerance individuals were furthest from human activity. So I think it could be interesting to then look at other populations, even Cannery Row off of Monterey, there's another large population of sea otters, or in Garrapatta, they might be distributed even within there because there's some areas with lots of beach access where kayaks get launched, but not necessarily lots of people wanting to swim in the open ocean. So looking in those smaller scales would be pretty cool.
Thank you.
Are there any online questions? I don't see any.
No.
No.
Perfect.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Well, thank you very much. Great job. And so we're going to steal her away for a little bit for a last little thing with her committee, and then we'll come back. It shouldn't take very long, but usually less than half an hour, and celebrate.
And if you're here in person, enjoy your snacks.